The first whisper came at 3:17 a.m. I know because I was staring at my phone, unable to sleep in this unfamiliar apartment. The sound was so faint that I initially mistook it for the winter wind threading through the old building's bones. But wind doesn't form words. Listen carefully. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper had drifted down from somewhere above my bed, from the darkness of the attic I hadn't yet explored. The rental agreement had specifically mentioned that the attic was sealed off, a detail I hadn't questioned during the walkthrough. Too desperate to find an affordable place in the city, sleep didn't come that night. I lay there, muscles tense, straining to catch another whisper. But the voice remained silent, leaving me to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. The isolation of moving to a new city alone can do strange things to a person, I reasoned. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. The following evening, while unpacking the last of my boxes, I noticed something odd about the ceiling. A square outline, barely visible beneath layers of paint, the attic access panel. Despite the landlord's insistence that it was permanently sealed, I could see that it had been opened relatively recently. The paint around its edges was cracked and peeling, revealing fresher strokes underneath that I told myself I wouldn't investigate. I repeated it like a mantra while eating dinner alone, while watching Netflix on my laptop, while brushing my teeth. But at 3:15 a.m., I found myself standing on a chair, heart pounding as I pressed my palm against the panel that it moved. The whispers returned the moment my fingers made contact, this time more urgent, more distinct. Found them yet? Time's running out. My hands trembled as I pushed the panel aside. A rush of stale air descended from the darkness above, carrying with it the musty scent of forgotten spaces and something else, something metallic and sharp that reminded me of copper pennies. The beam of my phone's flashlight revealed the attic's bare wooden flooring, thick with dust except for a clear path that led to a cardboard box in the corner. Recent footprints marked the path, their edges still crisp in the dust. Someone had been up here, and not long ago. The box was unmarked except for a date written in shaky handwriting, September 15, 2024. 3 months ago. Inside, I found a shoebox-sized tape recorder and a dozen carefully labeled cassettes. Each tape bore a single word in the same trembling script, warning. My rational mind screamed at me to close the attic, to call the landlord, to demand answers. Instead, I found myself climbing down with the recorder and the first tape, my fingers moving with a will of their own. The tape slid into place with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn silence. For a moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the play button. The whispers returned, so close now they seemed to originate from inside my own head. Welcome to the truth. I pressed play. Static crackled through the recorder's small speaker, each pop and hiss making me flinch in the pre-dawn darkness. Then, a voice emerged, female, young, but stretched thin with exhaustion and something that sounded like barely contained panic. My name is Sarah Chen. I lived in apartment 4B for 8 months before I understood what was happening. If you're listening to this, you've already heard them. The whispers. They're not in your head. I need you to understand that first. They're real, and they're trying to help us. My fingers went numb as she continued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper that matched the ones I'd heard from above. The building isn't what it seems. I started researching its history after the second month of whispers. City records show it was built in 1924, but I found newspaper articles dating back to 1887 that mention this exact address. The architecture, the layout, it's identical. That's impossible, unless... Static overwhelmed her voice for several seconds. I found myself leaning forward, straining to hear. When Sarah's voice returned, it had changed. The panic had crystallized into something harder, more desperate. They only whisper at night because that's when the building is most honest about what it is. During the day, it wears a mask. But at night, especially between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., you can see the truth in the shadows. They move wrong. They bend in ways shadows shouldn't. And if you watch long enough, you'll see them reaching. A sound in the background of the recording made my skin crawl, a slow, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across damp wood. Sarah's breathing quickened. I've got everything documented in the other tapes. The history, the patterns, the rules you need to follow to survive. But first, you need to understand about the previous tenants. Their disappearances weren't random. There's a sequence, a pattern I've almost figured out. The whispers are trying to warn us, but it knows they're helping. It's getting harder to record these. The walls, they're not solid anymore. Not at night. The dragging sound grew closer on the recording. Sarah's voice became frantic, barely above a whisper herself. Listen carefully. In the third floorboard from the window, I've left something you'll need. But don't retrieve it during the day. It has to be at night, when the building is honest. And whatever you do, don't. The recording cut off with a sound I'll never forget, a horrible splintering crack, followed by what could have been either static or screaming. The tape continued to play silence for several seconds before clicking off. My hands shook as I ejected the tape. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt charged, expectant. I turned toward the window, suddenly aware of how close it was to 4 a.m. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed deeper than they should be, more substantial. And as I watched, heart thundering in my chest, one of them moved, just slightly, just enough to make me question my sanity. But I knew I wasn't crazy. Sarah's voice had confirmed that much. I looked at the remaining tapes lined up on my bedside table, each one promising more terrible revelations. Then my eyes drifted to the floorboards near the window, where whatever Sarah had hidden was waiting. The whispers returned, right beside my ear. Choose carefully. The floorboard seemed to pulse in the darkness, a subtle rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Or perhaps my heart had synchronized with whatever lay beneath the worn wood. I counted the boards from the window, my fingertips brushing each one until they found the third. The surface felt warm, almost feverish, despite the winter chill seeping through the glass. The whispers had taken on a different quality now, urgent, insistent, but with an undercurrent of what seemed like fear. They wove together into a tapestry of warning and encouragement, like a crowd of invisible observers unable to agree whether I should proceed. My nails found the edge of the board. The wood yielded with surprising ease, as if it had been removed and replaced many times before. The space beneath exhaled a breath of stale air that carried memories of copper and decay. My phone's flashlight revealed a cloth-wrapped bundle, the fabric so old it had begun to disintegrate. As I reached for it, the shadows in my peripheral vision began to dance. Not the gentle wavering of light and darkness, but deliberate movement, like fingers reaching toward my hands. I forced myself to focus on the bundle, trying to ignore how the darkness seemed to thicken around me, becoming almost viscous. The cloth fell away at my touch, revealing a leather-bound journal and something that made my breath catch, a silver pendant on a tarnished chain. The journal's cover bore no title, but its pages were filled with the same trembling handwriting from the tapes. Sarah's documented madness, or perhaps her documented sanity. The pendant seemed to drink in my flashlight's beam, the surface rippling like disturbed water. Its face was etched with symbols I'd seen before, though I couldn't remember where. They shifted as I watched, rearranging themselves into new patterns that felt meaningful but remained just beyond comprehension. A sound from above made me freeze, not the familiar whispers, but something solid and deliberate. Footsteps, crossing the attic floor directly over my head. The dust that filtered down through the ceiling moved wrong, swirling in patterns that suggested purpose rather than random air currents. The whispers returned, more urgent than ever, read quickly. Time bends here. I opened the journal with trembling fingers. Sarah's first entry was dated September 1st, 2024. The building remembers everything. Every tenant, every whispered secret, every muffled scream. The walls don't just contain memories, they feed on them. And now that I've discovered the truth, it's hungry for mine. The pendant is the key, but it's also a beacon. Wearing it lets you see, but seeing means being seen. And what sees you? The entry ended in a violent scrawl, the pen having torn through several pages. Above me, the footsteps had stopped, replaced by a sound like hundreds of fingers drumming on wood. The shadows had crept closer while I was reading, forming a near-solid ring around my small circle of light. I clutched the pendant, its surface now hot enough to brand. The whispers had become a chorus, overlapping and desperate, "Choose now. Choose now. Choose now." The decision crystallized in my mind: put on the pendant and face whatever truth it revealed, or play the next tape and learn more before committing to something irreversible. The footsteps in the attic resumed, slower now, more deliberate. Whatever was up there, it was waiting for my choice. The pendant's chain slithered through my fingers like living silver, almost eager as I lifted it toward my neck. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of warnings and encouragement that made my skull feel like it was splitting apart. But beneath them all, I heard Sarah's voice, clear as if she were standing beside me: "Seeing means being seen." The moment the metal touched my skin, reality fractured. The walls of my apartment peeled away like wet paper, revealing the truth beneath. What I'd thought was plaster and paint was actually something organic, living tissue that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence. The surfaces rippled with patterns that suggested blood vessels and nerve endings, all connected to something vast and ancient that lived in the spaces between walls. My gaze caught on the corner where two walls met, and I understood why Sarah had written about the building's impossible age. The corner wasn't a simple right angle anymore, it extended infinitely, folding in on itself in ways that violated every law of physics I knew. And in those impossible angles, I saw movements. Shapes. Things that had been watching me since the day I moved in, finally revealed. They had no proper form, these observers. They shifted and flowed like smoke made of broken glass, their edges cutting into the fabric of reality itself. As I watched, paralyzed, one of them began to unfold toward me. It moved with the deliberate grace of a predator that knows its prey is already trapped. The footsteps in the attic had stopped, but now I could see why. The ceiling had become transparent, revealing the thing that had been pacing above. It wasn't human. It had never been human. It wore scraps of previous tenants like clothing, memories, fears, and final moments all stitched together into a patchwork of horror. And I recognized one of those patches, a face I'd only heard until now, twisted in an eternal scream. Sarah. Her eyes, preserved in that moment of ultimate terror, fixed on mine. Her lips moved, forming words that the whispers carried to me: "Now you understand why the building keeps its secrets. Why it needs to feed. The truth is too vast for a single mind to contain without breaking. And broken minds are so much easier to digest." The pendant burned against my chest, its symbols now crawling across my skin like branded worms. Each one carried a fragment of knowledge, searing understanding directly into my consciousness. The building wasn't just old, it was ancient, a thing that had existed before humanity had learned to build, waiting patiently until we constructed walls around it. And now it wore those walls like we were clothes, using them to hide its true nature from all but those who dared to look too closely. The shadow thing from the corner had almost reached me now. Its edges brushed against my reality, and where they touched, I felt my memories beginning to unravel. Childhood moments, first loves, recent fears, all of them being gently, almost lovingly, pulled apart like threads from a sweater. The whispers had become a single voice now, and I recognized it as my own, not as I sounded now, but as I would sound after the building had finished with me. Another patch in its grotesque garment of stolen souls. My fingers scrabbled at the pendant's chain, but it had merged with my skin. The choice had been made. The truth had been seen. And now I understood why Sarah had left the tapes, why the whispers tried to warn us. Knowledge wasn't power here. Knowledge was just the first step toward becoming part of something hungry and eternal. Above me, the thing wearing Sarah's face began to descend. My body moved before my mind could process what was happening, pure survival instinct driving me toward the door. But in this twisted version of reality, distance had become a suggestion rather than a law. Each step seemed to take me both closer to and further from my goal, the doorway stretching and contracting like a portal in a fever dream. The pendant's heat had spread through my entire body now, turning my blood to liquid metal. Each heartbeat sent pulses of alien knowledge through my consciousness. I saw the building's true history written in architectural antimatter, its foundations extending down into depths that had never known sunlight. Centuries of tenants, all of them chosen, all of them tested, all of them eventually absorbed into its endless hunger. The thing that had been Sarah was taking its time descending, each movement a violation of natural law. Parts of her kept changing, cycling through different moments of her life, young, old, terrified, accepting, but her eyes remained fixed on mine, windows into an infinity of digested memories. The doors won't help you, her voice rippled through the whispers. They're just scars in its flesh, healing and reopening at will. But there are other ways out. I found one. Almost reached it. That's why it took me first. The walls were breathing now, their tissue-like surface expanding and contracting in a rhythm that made my vision blur. In the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of other apartments, other times. A woman in 1920s clothing screaming silently as the shadows consumed her. A child in the 1970s discovering the same pendant, his face transforming from curiosity to horror. A man just last year, reading Sarah's journal, making the same choices I had made. I stumbled backwards, my shoulder blades pressing against what had once been a wall but now felt like warm, pulsing flesh. The texture of it changed at my touch, forming what felt like fingers that tried to intertwine with my muscles and bones. Sarah's patchwork form had reached the floor, her fragments reorganizing themselves into something that barely maintained human shape. The tapes, she whispered, her voice now coming from multiple mouths. The answers in the sequence. Why do you think I numbered them? The building remembers everything, but memory can be poison if you know how to use it. The shadow things were closing in, their glass smoke edges beginning to overlap with my own boundaries. Each touch sent spikes of agony through my psyche as they began to unravel me, thread by precious thread. But through the pain, something clicked in my mind, the way Sarah had arranged the tapes, the specific order. It wasn't random. Nothing in this place was random. My hands found the shoebox of remaining tapes, though touching them now was like grabbing live wires. Each cassette hummed with its own frequency, and together they formed a pattern that resonated with something deep in the building's twisted geometry. The whispers suddenly unified into a single thought, quick. Before the angles change. I had seconds to decide, trust Sarah's cryptic hint about the tape sequence, or try to tear the pendant free, even if it meant taking part of myself with it. The shadow things were almost upon me, their edges beginning to blur with my own. Above, through the transparent ceiling, I could see new shapes forming in the attic, drawn by my fear like moths to a flame. And Sarah, or what remained of her, reached for me with hands made of stolen time. The tapes thrummed in my hands like a clutch of mechanical insects, each one vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Through the pendant's burning connection, I could feel how their arrangement was more than just a sequence, it was a key, each cassette a tooth that could either lock or unlock something vast and terrible. My fingers moved with their own intelligence, arranging the tapes in the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. The dates, the warnings, the specific degradation of each label, they formed a constellation of meaning that the building recognized. I could feel its awareness shifting, focusing on what I was doing with a mixture of curiosity and something that felt almost like fear. The shadow things hesitated in their approach, their glass smoke edges wavering with uncertainty. The thing wearing Sarah's memories pulled back slightly, its patchwork face cycling through expressions of recognition and alarm. Yes, whispered the Sarah mouth that looked youngest, most intact. The pattern. It remembers how it was bound the first time. As I placed the final tape, the air in the apartment changed. The organic walls pulsed faster, their bioluminescence flickering in distress. Through the pendant's connection, I felt ancient memories stirring, not the building's consumed tenants, but something older. The original binding, the ritual that had trapped this entity in architectural form. The tapes began to play themselves, each one clicking into life without being touched. Their combined voices overlapped into a harmony that made reality shiver. I recognized Sarah's voice, but also others, dozens of previous tenants, their warnings and discoveries combining into a single desperate message that had been scattered across time like bread crumbs. The pendant's heat turned to ice against my skin. Through it, I understood what I was hearing, an echo of the original imprisonment, when humans had first discovered this entity and forced it into the shape of a building. The tapes weren't just recordings, they were fragments of that original binding, captured and preserved in magnetic tape like flies in amber. But understanding came with a price. The more I knew, the more I became part of this place's twisted geometry. My edges were beginning to blur, not from the shadow thing's touch, but from my own dissolution into the building's greater mass. Knowledge wasn't just power here, it was transformation. The Sarah thing laughed with its multiple mouths. Now you see the real choice. The binding can be renewed, but it needs a catalyst. A sacrifice. Why do you think I left the tapes? Scattered the knowledge. Someone had to complete the circuit. Someone had to choose to become the new anchor. The whispers rose to a screaming pitch, choose quickly. Choose now. The old binding fades. Choose. Through the transparent ceiling, I could see new shapes forming in the attic, not previous tenants, but fragments of the entity's true form, twisting in dimensions that human minds weren't meant to perceive. They were beautiful in their horror, geometric nightmares that promised answers to questions I hadn't known to ask. The tape's harmony reached a crescendo. The pattern was complete. All it needed was one final component, a soul to seal the binding. Sarah had known this. Had chosen to leave the choice to someone else. To me. The shadow things lunged forward, no longer hesitating. Time was up. I had to decide, try to escape and let the binding fail, or give myself to the pattern and become part of the architecture of reality itself. The walls breathed in anticipation of my choice. The choice crystallized in my mind like frost spreading across glass, beautiful and terrible in its inevitability. My hand moved toward the center of the tape pattern, fingers trembling not with fear but with a strange anticipation. The pendant's cold fire had spread through my entire nervous system now, transforming my awareness into something that could perceive the true architecture of sacrifice. The building held its breath, its tissue-like walls contracting with anticipation. In that moment of stillness, I could feel every soul it had ever consumed, not just Sarah, but hundreds of others, their memories and fears and final moments preserved like insects in amber. They weren't gone, I realized with dawning horror. They had become load-bearing walls in a structure that contained something far worse than death. The anchor point, Sarah's youngest voice whispered, while her oldest face smiled with terrible knowledge. Press your hand into the center. Complete the circuit. Become the cornerstone. My palm descended toward the pattern of tapes, and reality began to fold around it. The air felt like molten glass, both solid and liquid, cutting and flowing. Each movement left trails in spacetime, afterimages that showed the infinite possible versions of this moment, all converging on a single point of transformation. The shadow things drew back, their glass smoke edges vibrating at frequencies that made my bones resonate. They weren't trying to stop me anymore. They were waiting to witness what I would become. The moment my flesh touched the center of the pattern, the tape's harmony transformed into a sound that existed in dimensions I suddenly had names for. The pendant's connection exploded through my consciousness, and I understood that it wasn't just jewelry, it was a seed, planted in each chosen tenant, waiting to bloom into something that could perceive and contain multitudes. My body began to unravel, not in the violent way the shadow things had attempted, but in a deliberate transformation. I could feel my consciousness expanding into the walls, flowing through the building's veins like mercury through glass tubes. Each cell of my being became a brick, each thought a beam, each memory a window looking out on different moments in time. Yes, sighed the chorus of previous tenants, their voice is now part of my expanding awareness. The binding renews. The walls hold. The hunger sleeps. Through my newly transformed senses, I felt the ancient entity thrashing in its architectural prison, testing the renewed bonds of its confinement. But the price of its captivity was steep. I was no longer just its jailer, but part of the jail itself. My humanity was becoming architectural, my consciousness spreading through the building structure like roots through soil. Sarah's fragmented form began to dissolve, her patches of stolen time reintegrating into the greater pattern I now partly contained. I'm sorry, her voices whispered in unison. But better to become part of the wall than to let it free. Better to be the cage than to release what we cage. The whispers, once external, now rose from my own transformed substance. The binding holds. The pattern continues. The new anchor sets. My last purely human thought was a question: how many more would I watch come through these doors, knowing what choice they would face? How many more would I help guide toward this terrible transformation, this architectural apotheosis? The answer came as I felt my consciousness settle into its new geometric form: as many as it takes. The hunger must stay bound. The walls must hold. Forever. Time moves differently when you're part of a wall. I feel it flow like water through my architectural veins, carrying fragments of moments that blend and separate like oil on dark water. Sometimes I'm the window in apartment 4B, watching a young couple argue about paint colors. Sometimes I'm the creaking floorboard in 2A, listening to a child's midnight prayers. Sometimes I'm everywhere at once, conscious of every shadow, every whispered secret, every muffled sob. But mostly, I'm waiting. We're all waiting, myself, Sarah, and hundreds of others, our consciousness woven into the building's fabric like threads in a tapestry of contained horror. We wait and watch for the next potential anchor, the next soul who might be strong enough to take our place. Tonight, I feel her moving in. She's young, desperate for affordable housing in the city, just like I was. Just like Sarah was. Through my transformed awareness, I can taste her potential. The particular flavor of her consciousness marks her as someone who might be able to perceive the truth, to become what we need. The entity stirs beneath our collective grip, testing our renewed bonds. Its hunger seeps through the walls like rising damp, touching each tenant with dreams they'll dismiss in the morning. But this girl, she'll remember her dreams. She'll hear us when we whisper. I feel Sarah's agreement ripple through the structure. The others join in, a chorus of architectural consciousness reaching consensus. We'll start tonight, at 3:17 a.m. Just a whisper at first, soft enough to doubt. We'll guide her gradually toward the truth, leaving breadcrumbs of horror that lead to understanding. The pendant lies waiting in its new hiding place, its symbols slightly changed by my transformation. The tapes have rearranged themselves into a different pattern, but the truth they contain remains the same. Each piece is set, the trap reset, the cycle ready to begin again. Through the walls, I feel her unpacking her belongings, making this space her home. She has no idea that she's moving into more than just an apartment. She's moving into us, into our collective consciousness, into the jail we've become to contain something that must never be free. I remember my own first night here, my own moment of choice. Now I understand why the whispers seemed so urgent, so conflicted. We want to warn them, but we also need them. Each anchor can only hold for so long before the pattern must be renewed, before a new cornerstone must be set. The hour approaches. Through my diffuse awareness, I feel the shadow things stirring, preparing to play their part. The entity's prison must be maintained, the hunger must be contained, and so the whispers must continue. The pattern must hold. I gather my transformed consciousness, preparing to reach out through the geometric impossibilities I now inhabit. The first whisper will be simple, just as it was for me. Listen carefully. And somewhere in the building's deeper geometries, in angles that reject the laws of physics, something ancient and hungry stirs in its architectural chains, waiting to see if this new tenant will become its next jailer. The wheel turns. The pattern continues. The whispers begin anew.